Let's talk about your journey for a moment. You and I, kind of before getting started here, we talked about luck and the role of luck. And actually, we had talked about this a year ago. I remember this. I remember a little bit about how you talked about it as well. You thought you've been really lucky with your opportunities.
Right.
And, sometimes I'm a firm believer that sometimes luck is when preparedness meets opportunity.
Right.
And so clearly, you couldn't have tackled these lucky opportunities if you weren't prepared. But maybe before the lucky opportunities hit, what was your preparation as a technologist, as a leader, prior to kind of where from college onward? How did you get into this profession?
Oh, how I got into it?
Yeah, how'd you get into it?
Well, I actually started. Many of your listeners might know the old Trash 80s from Radio Shack, right?
The TRS 80s,
the TRS 80s. So my best friend growing up in Greentown, Ohio, his dad was a troubleshooter for AT&T. And he had bought a TRS 80, and we were loading this game called Empire on it. And we would play Empire all the time. You remember that?
Yes.
And so Mike and I got really good at it, and we got bored. So we decided that we were going to decompile it. And I bought a book on basic programming and started to teach myself basic programming.
Really? Okay.
And we reprogrammed it and recompiled it so that we added like new countries and and literally these were, stored on cassettes that plugged into the back of the TRS. And so we added different countries, and the barbarians could attack us a little earlier, and we made all these different rules. And then I taught myself programming that way, and then I just fell in love with it. And so then maybe a year or two later, I was watching 60 Minutes with my dad, and there was an interview that had Gates and the guys from HP and Stephen Jobs, and they were all in Silicon Valley, and they were all the new millionaires, right?
Yeah.
And they were in technology, and I'd already had this interest, and I looked at my dad and I go, "That's what I'm going to do." And so,
and you were in Ohio, right? That's where you were.
Yeah, I was in Ohio. And so from then on, that was kind of like my mission, was to go into the technology space. So I always get confused when people are like, oh, they were like rudderless or they don't know what they were going to do. Because I was like, well, I was 12 and I figured it out, which is not really what my kids want to hear, right? But
you're like the momentum was going this way and I'm going that way.
Exactly. So, by 1980, I had it locked and loaded.
So did you go right from, did you go to Ohio State, was it?
No, I went to Miami of Ohio.
Miami of Ohio, okay.
And so computer science at Miami of Ohio. And then I was in the Air Force ROTC. So I kind of knew what I was going to do when I got out, right? So I got
out an officer.
Came out an officer, and I got into a slot called a 4925, which is a data systems analyst after I graduated, right? So that was my specialty code. And I got stationed at Wright-Patterson in Dayton, Ohio, and in Systems Command. When I got up there, they assigned me to AFHRL, which is the Human Resources Lab. Okay. And so this is where I say that it was kind of like luck, right? Yeah, I felt like it was luck because, who knew I was going to get there? But when I got up there, I met this guy, David Gunning. And David Gunning had graduated from Stanford, and he was like one of the Air Force's big brains. And he was in, kind of running the show of this new project called Interactive Electronic Tech Manuals. And so the Air Force had taken the lead in doing a transformation to stop the Air Force technicians from literally driving from plane to plane with a pickup truck that had manuals taking up half of the bed.
Oh my goodness!
Right, and so what our job was to.
Is this late 80s?
This
is
1988, 89.
Okay, so it's late 80s,
early 90s.
Okay,
and so I got assigned as a new lieutenant and I worked right for Dave and for David Johnson. A lot of Daves there, and at HRL. And so we had the hardware side of the guy was building, like this is before laptops were really big, right?
Sure.
So we were physically building a hardened laptop, right? Device that could be in there. And then the software side was how do we take all the data that was in these tech manuals and encode it, right? And we decided to use SGML. And my job was to write the first DTD for the Air Force. And that eventually became a tri-service specification.
What's a DTD?
Document type definition. So this was before like schemas in XML.
Oh, yeah.
So SGML was the predecessor.
Oh.
And so again, like you learning this new technology and then, our job at the time was we were going to transform so that the guy was driving around and he would just plug this IETM device into the F-16 and to the built-in testing, and download the diagnostics. And then we created authoring systems for SGML and then a presentation system for SGML to be able to render and to do the diagnostics instead of him hunting through paper. Right. So that was really, excuse me, a lot of fun. And it was like one of the things where I enjoyed going out, because we did these tests where we'd go out with the technicians, and it kind of made me learn to go out and listen to the end users. Right. And so we'd see him work and what they would do and what worked and didn't work. And then we would go back and either tweak the data model or tweak the presentation or tweak the hardware. So over the 4 years that I was at Wright Pat, that's what we did. And when you downloaded was this at the point where it was just the engine manuals, or is it the whole manual? The whole thing,
the whole plane?
Everything, the whole plane, the whole F-16. So whether or not it was an engine or whether it was a cockpit or whatever, you could just plug it in there. And then it became a tri-service spec. So I would work with the Army for like the M2 tanks, and we were working with the Navy with their planes, and with their, like the Aegis. We worked a lot on the Aegis, which was a new cruiser which was being built in the late 80s and early 90s. And excuse me. And so it became what was known as a tri-service spec. And the other really cool thing that I got to do was SGML was becoming quite popular. So there were dedicated SGML conferences. And so the Air Force said, well, you're an officer, you need to give briefings, go talk about this, because they wanted to promote it, because this was something that was new technology that the Air Force was doing. So I got an opportunity to go speak at all these SGML shows, which expanded my network a lot, which in turn helped me get my job at Passage Systems in Silicon Valley, which was one of my dream jobs anyway. So, and as I came up on the end of my 4 years, that's what I'd met this guy, Bob Glushko, and he had started Passage Systems, and that's what got me out to the West Coast.
And what did you actually learn with SGML? Like, just if we can get kind of technical for a moment, what did that give you the ability to do that they didn't have before, other than paper?
Yeah.
Like,
well, I think the key was with the content data model, and the way that we approached using SGML was different than other people that were doing it in the 80s. Because, I mean, SGML was created in IBM back in the 60s, late 60s. This guy, Charles Goldfarb, created it. I became friends with Charles, actually, speaking on the circuit. And so he was very intrigued with this because the way that we were approaching it was, how do we model the data in a way that could be used not just to print, right? Because a lot of times you would encode it like a TROF document or a FrameMaker document, or, all these different word processing document applications that were coming up. We were modeling it as a generic data set, right? And we were actually using it to write it back and forth to an object database, and then to read it in to render it. And so being able to look at the data as a way that it can be reused in multiple ways, in terms of whether it's going to be a single document type definition, DTD, that could be used for an M2 tank or an F-16 or an Aegis ship, right?
So it's portability. It was a portability.
Portability, and looking at it at a higher level, more at an object level, than down at just, I want to encode it so I can print it. Right. And so I think that was very helpful in how we approached that, and kind of always taught me from an architecture standpoint to think more outside the box. It's like, you might be building an application for a particular purpose, but you need to think about how else could the application be used. Right. And I think that's important as you start to build applications, because, like I was talking to you before, it's really fun if you can be transforming an industry or transforming the way somebody works, right? Which is kind of a theme of my career, is to try and get myself into those kinds of positions. So it was the technicians in the Air Force. And then when I got out to Passage, we were looking at how do we transform the software or the technology industry from, basically, remember when software was sold in stores in boxes, right? Yeah. And you had a physical manual that was printed, and and all of that. So Passage was really built to transform that software and hardware industry, or the technology industry, into using CD-ROMs. And so instead of having to print all this paper, and this was before like all the eco-friendly stuff, right?
Yeah.
We're talking 93, 94
right.
now.
I remember this. So you're taking like the old cassettes
we're turning them into, instead of paper manuals, you would get a CD-ROM. So you would put it in and it would give you instructions on doing your installation and your user guides and all that kind of stuff. And so we started that in 92. I got out there in late 92 and 93. So we built this Passage Hub and Passage Pro. So we would start to convert early versions of Word or FrameMaker or TROF or Interleaf, right, documents into, again, another SGML. And what I wound up doing there was I took the CDM, the content data model, and we created something I call Passage Hub. So we would convert all of those formatted documents, right? Because it had all that styling in it. And we converted it into this generic hub that I could then convert, and basically we could create all kinds of different manuals dynamically.
So it's interesting that hub model. When you said that the tri-service, Army, Navy, Air Force, you had to create a model that was portable between the different types of military equipment,
right?
And it seems like that hub model was you wanted the similar portability between.
We did the exact same thing. So what I wanted working with one of my mentors, Vance Nakamoto, who was the CEO of Passage Systems, he was
Vance,
yeah, and so he was always talking about, like, we don't want to we're starting with the hardware, software, the technology industry, but we'd like to go into other verticals, right, and take this book technology into other verticals. And so by doing it in a generic fashion with the hub, we could convert it from a Word file or an Interleaf file into the Passage Hub, and then we could very easily translate it into the DocBook DTD for the tech industry, or the Pinnacles DTD for, like, we worked with Hitachi for the semiconductor industry and for Intel. And so, we were in Santa Clara, right, which is the middle of all of it. And so all of that became just very interesting to me, to be able to leverage that Passage Hub to go into other verticals. And so we were doing that for a couple years, and then obviously we met with Andreessen and it was Jim Clark, right after they started Netscape.
Okay.
We were actually right down the road from them in Palo Alto, and they said that we should. This is a lesson learned for me. Otherwise, we might not be talking together. But we actually sat down with them, and they're like, "Well, we really like your Passage Hub technology. How about you do that and convert it and generate HTML for us, because we have this browser we just Aunt Mark just created. It's getting really popular." And we're like, kind of looking at them, and one of our founders, the guy that I first knew, was like, "No, SGML is the way to go, not this HTML. It's too simple."
Oh my God.
So we skipped it. Lesson learned there, or I would not. I would already be on an island somewhere. But yeah. So we did actually start to generate HTML and very early on. But remember, from like 95 to 98 timeframe, most of it was just building a web page, right?
Yeah,
the companies were just learning it.
That was the launch of the real internet.
It
really
was
with Windows 95 and
exactly
the first browsers,
first Internet Explorer browser with Netscape,
and we had the browser
Netscape
war
and the
between
browser
Netscape and Microsoft.
So we were like right in the middle of all that out there in Silicon Valley, which was a lot of fun. Everything moved fast, I'll tell you. Yeah. So again, the Passage Hub and the helping that industry kind of transform from paper.
Similar theme.
From paper to electronic. And so I feel like that's been kind of one of the areas that has been a thread or a theme of all of my companies. Maybe I looked for them, or maybe I fell into it, but a lot of the different companies that I've worked with and been a part of.